thought he had all the motion. I thought when the king says, Hassan, I'm ordaining him with the he's not an anti-Semite beam. You know, it turns out it didn't work. On this issue, they just didn't even talk about it. Like they didn't even like none of the advocacy groups, none of the people even got mad at Ezra Kline. They did something much more interesting, which is they never said anything about Ezra. Because I feel like if they had attacked Ezra Kline, that would have actually drawn more attention to the issue. And instead of doing that, they just did not say anything, which was smart. I will hand it to the advocacy groups. They didn't say anything about Ezra Kline's piece at all, and they just pretended that it didn't exist. And then it kind of went nowhere, which is a little sad because I did think, you know, oh, Ezra's got my back. It's over. You know, it's we're safe. Like I'm safe. I've been marked safe from being called an anti-Semite. Turns out, nope, not at all.
Thing was not that this like collection of podcasts or this part of the culture had decided like they wouldn't talk to Democrats. It is that to a first approximation, the Democrats had decided they wouldn't talk to them.
Yeah. Anyone, I'll be fair. We almost had Kamala on, and then we were talking to her people, and I was like, well, if she comes on, we have to talk about this, and we have to talk about this, and we have to talk about that. We have to talk about her life. And who people who are running the show are afraid. And they weren't on the right. They were like, yeah, you say whatever you want to say. No one cares. Like, it's just get out there. But they're so hyper vigilant on the left about protecting like personas.
This goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier when I was saying that what the right came to understand under Trump is that attention is a volume game.
Yeah.
And just being in front of people is the single most valuable thing you can do. Whereas on the left, at least kind of up till
Connor, I loved abundance in Vape Nation until I found out about Ezra Kline's wife's service in the IDF. Stop, Connor. Oh my God, Connor, you should have Ezra Kline on Fortnite Fridays. Honestly, Ezra Kline on Fortnite Fridays would pop off, would bang.